They lied to you about who you are. And the crazy part? Even the spiritual teachers keep repeating the same lie. They tell you, become the observer. Watch your thoughts. Separate yourself from the mind. But what if the entire concept of an observer is the trap? In the underground temples of ancient Kemet, Thoth encoded something that modern psychology still hasn't grasped. Krishnamurti spent 60 years trying to explain it. Jung circled around it in his Red Book. Even neuroscience is getting close, but from the wrong angle. In this video, you're going to discover why the mirror principle that Egyptian initiates used completely dissolves the illusion of self. The forbidden practice where silence wasn't peaceful, it was weaponized, and how a single internal shift can end guilt, anxiety, and suffering, not gradually, but instantly. But first, you need to understand what's actually happening when you try to observe your mind. Because that attempt to watch yourself, that's the prison disguised as freedom. Here's something strange. Right now, as you're hearing these words, there's a voice in your head providing commentary. It's been with you your entire life. Sometimes it's the critic that tears you apart. Sometimes it's the cheerleader pumping you up. Sometimes it's just narrating your day like a documentary. I need to respond to that email. Why did I say that thing earlier? I'm hungry. This video is interesting. That voice never shuts up. And at some point, maybe in a meditation class or while reading Eckhart Tolle, someone told you the solution. Don't be the voice. Be the one watching the voice. Be the observer. Sounds reasonable, right? If you can create distance between you and your thoughts, you'll find peace. But here's the problem nobody mentions. That observer. It's just another thought. In the mystery schools of ancient Egypt, there was a practice called the Chamber of Silence. Deep within the pyramids, in rooms engineered to eliminate every trace of external stimulus, initiates would sit for 3 days and nights. Complete darkness, absolute quiet. No food, no water. Nothing but their own mind echoing in the void. Most people think the goal was to quiet the thoughts, to achieve some blissful, empty state. But that's not what happened. What happened was this. In the absence of external distraction, the mind went into overdrive. Every fear surfaced, every memory replayed. The voice became deafening. And then, somewhere in the 3rd day, when exhaustion finally stripped away the capacity to resist, something shifted. The initiate would notice, even the one trying to quiet the thoughts is just another thought. The observer attempting to create silence is itself more noise. And in that recognition, the separation collapsed. Not because the initiate became enlightened, but because they saw through the fundamental mistake they'd been making their entire life, trying to improve the person when there was never a person to improve. Only consciousness, temporarily identifying with a form, then forgetting it was ever free. Alan Watts used to say it like this: trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth. You can't step outside of yourself to look at yourself, because wherever you step, that's still you. The observer is just the ego wearing a spiritual costume. Thoth's teaching described human experience through 2 primary lenses: the ka, consciousness itself, formless and eternal, and the khat, the body-mind apparatus, temporary and ever-changing. Most people live their entire existence fused with the khat. They believe they are their autobiography, the collection of memories, preferences, opinions, fears. When spirituality enters the picture, the common teaching offers a partial liberation. You're not the khat, you're the ka. You're not the content of consciousness. You are consciousness itself. Sounds like freedom, right? But it creates a new problem. Now there's a subtle war happening inside. The ka trying to distance itself from the khat, awareness attempting to not get lost in thoughts, consciousness striving to remain pure and undisturbed. But here's what Thoth understood, and what trips up even advanced practitioners. The ka doesn't distance itself from anything. It can't, because distance implies 2 things, and there's only one. The ka doesn't observe the khat like a scientist observing an experiment. The ka is the khat, temporarily forgetting what it is. Like an actor so immersed in a role that they momentarily believe they are the character. The liberation isn't in the actor stepping back from the role. It's in the actor remembering mid-performance, "Oh, I'm acting," and continuing to act anyway, not from compulsion, but from play. Krishnamurti spent 6 decades trying to articulate this. He said, When the observer is the observed, there is no conflict. That's not poetry. That's a description of what actually happens when the illusion collapses. Because when you truly see that the one watching and the one being watched are the same, the entire structure of the ego falls apart. There's nobody left to control anything, nobody left to strive, nobody left to judge or be judged, just awareness recognizing itself. Here's what Thoth inscribed in the Emerald Tablets, and what very few initiates ever understood. As above, so below. As within, so without. This isn't philosophy. It's a literal description of how consciousness works. The awareness that observes your thoughts is the same awareness that creates them. There aren't two. There never were. Think about a mirror. In the ancient temples, Egyptian priests developed a practice that would completely dismantle a seeker's sense of self. They called it the mirror of Ma'at. Ma'at represented cosmic order, truth, balance. Her symbol was a feather, impossibly light. When someone died, mythology says their heart was weighed against this feather. If heavier, they couldn't proceed to the afterlife. Most people think this is about moral judgment, but the initiates understood something deeper. The heart represents everything you've accumulated, your achievements, your failures, the stories you tell about who you are, the grudges you hold, the pride you protect, all of it. Weight, the feather. It's not lightness as in goodness. It's lightness as in emptiness, the absence of self-image. So priests would place initiates before an actual mirror, not to admire themselves, to destroy themselves. They'd ask, "Whose face is that?" You'd answer, "Mine." "And who sees the face?" "I do." "Show me this eye." You'd point to your reflection. "That's not you. That's an image." You'd point to your body. "That body appears in awareness. It's seen. Are you what's seen, or what sees?" You'd gesture to your mind. "Thoughts come and go. Are you the coming and going, or what remains when they're gone?" The initiate would spiral into confusion, because every answer they gave could be observed, and if it can be observed, it can't be the observer. But here's the devastating part. Eventually they'd realize the observer can also be observed. The sense of "I am watching" is itself something noticed. So what's noticing that? This is where the mirror shatters, because you can't find yourself. Not because you're hidden, but because you're not a thing that can be found. You're the finding itself. This is the secret that destroys the ego. The ego can only exist when there's separation. A me in here and a world out there. An observer here and thoughts over there. But the instant you recognize that the feeling of being someone watching your life is just as illusory as any other feeling, something breaks. And the strangest part, when that happens, you don't become empty. You become everything. Let me show you the 3 levels of identity illusion. Most people never make it past the second. Level 1, you believe you are the voice. You're completely identified with your thoughts. When the voice says, "You're a failure," you believe it. When it says, "You're special," you believe that too. You don't even know there's anything beyond the voice. The majority of humanity lives and dies at this level. Level 2, you discover the observer. This usually happens through meditation, trauma, or spontaneous insight. Suddenly you realize, I'm not my thoughts. There's something in me that watches them. This brings massive relief. You finally have space. You don't have to react to every thought that appears. But here's the problem. Now you have a new kind of prison. You identify as the observer, and you spend your life trying to protect it, trying to stay in it, trying not to get dragged back into thoughts. This creates a subtle but constant internal war. And then there's the third recognition, the one that obliterates everything you thought you knew. You begin to notice something unsettling. This observer you've been protecting, this inner witness you thought was finally the real you. It comes and goes. Some moments there's a clear sense of watching. Other moments, you're so absorbed in experience that the watcher disappears completely. If the observer was truly you, how could it vanish? What's watching when the watcher isn't there? This is where the whole structure falls apart, because you start to see that awareness itself has no qualities, no position, no perspective, no identity. Thoughts appear in it. Emotions move through it. Even the sense of being an observer arises within it. But awareness itself, it's not a thing you can point to. It's the space where all things appear, and space doesn't have a center. When this lands, not as an idea but as direct recognition, the search ends. Not because you found yourself, but because you realized there was never anyone lost. Thoth called this dissolving the car into the cut. Not in the sense of losing consciousness, but in the sense of stopping the separation between awareness and experience. You stop being someone living life. You become life happening. Krishnamurti tried for decades to transmit this. He'd say, "The thinker is the thought." There's no thinker separate from thinking. There's only the movement of thought. And when you observe that movement without creating an observer, the movement stops. Not because you suppressed it, but because it exhausted itself. Now here's where this gets really interesting. Why was this knowledge hidden? Why, out of everything Thoth taught, was this specific truth reserved only for the highest level initiates? Because it destroys every system of control. Think about it. Every form of authority, religious, political, social, depends on you believing you're someone who needs to be saved, someone who needs to obey, someone who needs to improve. When you recognize there's nobody there, that the entire structure of ego is a functional illusion, but not a fundamental truth, you become ungovernable, not in the sense of being rebellious or destructive, but in the sense that no ideology, no fear, no promise of reward can manipulate you anymore. The Egyptian priests knew this. That's why the chamber of silence was forbidden to those who weren't ready. Because once you cross that threshold, there's no going back. You can still function in the world, work, relate, make choices, but internally, something fundamental has changed. You don't take yourself seriously anymore. Carl Jung, who studied Hermeticism deeply, called this individuation, the process of becoming whole. But he also warned, individuation isn't becoming special. It's dissolving the illusion that you're separate from the whole. Terence McKenna said it another way. The syntactical nature of reality, the real secret of magic, is that the world is made of words, and if you know the words that the world is made of, you can make of it whatever you wish. But the deepest magic? Recognizing that the one speaking the words and the words being spoken are the same. There's a reason the Gnostics called this world the demiurge's prison. Not because the physical world is evil, but because we're trapped in a consensus trance, a collective agreement that we're all separate individuals struggling to survive and succeed. The archons in Gnostic cosmology weren't literal demons. They were thought forms, mental parasites that feed on your belief that you're a limited, separate self. The moment you see through that belief, the archons vanish. Not because you fought them, but because they were never real to begin with. David Bohm, the quantum physicist, described this as the implicate order. Everything you see, separate objects, separate people, separate thoughts, is the explicate order, the surface level. But underneath, folded into everything, is the implicate order, the unified field where everything is connected, where observer and observed are one. Modern neuroscience is starting to catch up. Studies at Johns Hopkins on psilocybin-assisted therapy show that ego dissolution, the temporary collapse of the sense of self, leads to lasting reductions in depression, anxiety, and addiction. Why? Because when the ego dissolves, people report the same thing. I realized I'm not who I thought I was. I'm something much larger. But here's what they miss. You're not larger. You're not anything. And that's the liberation. So what do you actually do with this? How do you live knowing the observer is an illusion? First, stop trying to be the observer. When you catch yourself trying to watch your thoughts, ask, who's trying to watch? Watch the watcher. And then watch the one watching the watcher. Keep going until you realize there's no end to it. That observation isn't something you do, it's something that's happening. Second, let the sense of being someone come and go without resistance. Sometimes you'll feel like a separate individual. That's fine. Other times that feeling will completely dissolve. Also fine. You don't need to force anything. Just notice when the illusion is active and when it's absent. Third, and most important, live. Not as someone trying to reach enlightenment, but as consciousness itself playing at being human, with all the contradictions, imperfections, and mysteries that includes. In the temples of Karnak, after 3 days of silence, the initiate would emerge from the chamber and be brought before the mirror of Ma'at one final time. The priest would ask, Who are you? And if the initiate answered with anything, any word, any concept, they were sent back. Because the correct answer isn't a word. It's the silence that hears the question being asked and recognizes there's nobody there to answer it. The Lakota have a teaching. Mitakuye Oyasin. All my relations. Everything is related. Everything is connected. When you see a tree, you're not separate from it. You're both expressions of the same life force, temporarily wearing different forms. The Hopi prophecy speaks of the day of purification, not as an external apocalypse, but as the moment when humanity remembers who they really are. Not separate individuals competing for survival, but one consciousness experiencing itself through infinite perspectives. Ramana Maharshi, the Indian sage, used to tell people to ask themselves, "Who am I?" Not intellectually, but as a living inquiry. Keep asking until the question collapses, because the one asking, "Who am I?" is the same one being asked about. The subject and object are identical. Here's a practice that cuts through the illusion of separation. Not a technique, really, more like a recognition. The Egyptian priests had a gesture they'd used during the final moments of the Chamber of Silence. When the initiate was suspended between waking and trance, barely holding onto the sense of self, the priest would gently touch the space between their eyebrows, the seat of the third eye, and whisper a single word: dissolve. Not the thoughts, not the emotions, not even the observer. Dissolve the one who thinks they're separate from what's happening. You can do this right now. Bring your attention to the space between your eyes, not forcefully. Just gently notice it. Now ask yourself, who is noticing this space? Don't answer intellectually, just feel into the question. And then notice, that question is also appearing in awareness. So who's aware of the question? Keep going. Every time you think you've found the watcher, notice that the watcher is being watched. There's no end to this, not because you're missing something, but because there's nobody there to find. There's only the infinite regress of awareness recognizing itself. When this lands, really lands, something extraordinary happens. Guilt evaporates, because guilt needs a separate self to blame. Without that self, guilt has nowhere to stick. Fear softens, because fear is always about protecting a fictional future self. When you see the self as a story, fear loses its urgency. Even grief transforms, not because you stop caring, but because you realize what's grieving and what's being grieved are not two separate things. This doesn't make you cold or detached. It makes you immediate, present, responsive to life without the filter of what does this mean for me, because there's no longer a separate me that everything has to pass through. This doesn't mean you become indifferent. It means you act from a different place, not from protection but from presence, not from control but from spontaneous response. Rumi wrote, "Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." That field is what remains when the observer dissolves. It's not emptiness, it's fullness without form, not absence, presence without boundaries. And here's the beautiful part. You don't need to become someone else to get there. You don't need 20 years of meditation. You don't need to retreat to a mountain. You don't need to follow any guru. You just need to recognize what's already happening. Right now, as these words are being heard, there's an awareness receiving them. That awareness has no name, no age, no history. It simply is. And it's not yours. It's you. But not the you think you are. The you that exists before any thought about who you are. So here's the invitation. Not to do something, but to stop doing. For the next 7 days, watch for just one thing. When the internal voice appears, judging, planning, narrating, don't try to observe it from somewhere separate. Just notice, this voice is also being seen. And then ask, without expecting an answer, who sees the voice? And when a sense of an observer arises, someone who's watching, ask again, who sees the observer? Continue until nobody remains, until there's only seeing happening, no seer, no seen, just this. And if during those 7 days you catch a glimpse of true silence, don't try to hold it. Don't try to recreate it. Just recognize, this silence isn't absence. It's your original face, the one you had before your parents were born, the one that will remain when everything else dissolves. Thoth called this remembering, not learning something new, but recalling what always was. Krishnamurti called it insight, a direct flash of truth that doesn't pass through the filter of thought. The Gnostics called it gnosis, direct knowing, unmediated recognition. But names don't matter. What matters is that you stop searching outside for what can only be recognized inside. You were never the voice in your head. You were never the observer trying to control the voice. You are the silence where both appear. And silence doesn't get stained by what moves through it. If something in this video resonated with you, it's not because I taught you something new. It's because you recognized something you already knew. The initiates of ancient Egypt had a phrase they'd speak after completing the chamber of silence. Leave it in the comments if this awakened something in you. I remember who I am. Not for me, but to seal the portal you just crossed. Check out the next videos on the screen. One of them might be the mirror you needed. I'll meet you in the next journey. Until then, rest in the silence you are.